So I'm Ken Krull. 45 seconds on my background. I actually was an industrial design student in the Centrum program in Washington State, and I came out to go to school in Utah. I studied economics at BYU. You'd see me hanging out at the Brimhall building for those of you who are familiar with the campus there. And when I graduated, I had a choice to be a Wall Streeter or go into technology. And at the time, it seemed like all the brightest folks were in tech, but 10 years in tech, I got pulled back on the finance side into being a venture capitalist and a private equity guy. Was the investor in Skullcandy Headphones and Fusion.io. And shortly after doing that, I got an invitation from Rob Webker, who's here today, who I knew from my technology days, to be a director at the Foundry. So today I'm talking for a minute about what the Foundry is. So Rob is the originator of the Foundry concept. And he was a postdoc faculty at the University of Utah, where he wanted to help entrepreneurs and give back to the Utah community. Interestingly, there's already resources to give some things back to the entrepreneurial community. If you're familiar with business incubation, there's something like 10,000 business incubators in the world and maybe 2,000 in North America, which would be, on average, maybe 40 business incubators inside of a state like Utah. And there's also a lot of institutions that do business execution. If you're familiar with the Association for Corporate Growth, they do that, and most of your business school programs also do business execution. Interestingly, if you look at this on a continuum, there's very few entities that work on business discovery, which is how do you determine what is actually a viable business? Although you'll find that it doesn't keep businesses from actually incubating things that are not really business ideas. And occasionally you'll even find an idea, for those of you who remember the bubble in something like Webvan, a business that tries to get executed as a late-stage business, which is not really a business idea. So you'll see that the boxes, although we put them in similar size, are not really how prevalent these three concepts are. They're more, in my stage of thinking, the importance of the three concepts. In that if you take something like business discovery and you skip that step, then you're incubating something that's poor. Hence, we have the origin of Foundry. Although it's focused on business discovery, as I make a couple more points, you'll see that business discovery and the design theory that goes along with business discovery is actually really useful when you're incubating a business or trying to execute a business as well. So, I think when Rob got here, really what he found in terms of resources for entrepreneurs was there were business plan competitions inside of Utah, and there were some resources for inventors to try and discover ideas. But the mission of the Foundry is really to fill a local gap that exists. What does this all have to do with design theory? Well, a lot of the concepts that we use inside of the Foundry are really about experiments that are tests for entrepreneurs. Eric Ries documents this in the Lean Startup and specifically talks about how validated learning will help you demonstrate that you've actually discovered a business. This is the prime tenet of what the Foundry does for entrepreneurs here in Utah. Interestingly, business discovery, also known as the scientific method, also known as design theory. Right? It's not a concept that's necessarily unique to entrepreneurship. It's just one that hasn't been applied overly thoroughly. We ask the question inside of discovering a business, do you really have a business? And along the lines of having a business, we break those questions down into sub-questions like, can I make this thing, which I think I need for this business? Can I sell this thing, which I think I have? And we continue to break down these questions into subparts. When we get to the end of these processes, we find that we create a discipline about testing hypotheses around a business concept, where we only allow the students to raise money for a business when they have a question or a hypothesis that they need to test, that they can't test without spending money on it. right? So we try and do all of the business discovery as lean as possible. Some of the instruments that we have for the Foundry, some of this comes out of talking to your actual customer. My understanding is that when Rob was doing original data gathering on what entrepreneurs needed, he was mostly talking to the millennium crowd, which is probably many of you today. And you'll find that the traditional incubators didn't serve that crowd very well. Specifically in regard to mentors, the principals of this organization would say, we don't really want any old dudes talking to us about how it was in the good old days. We can figure out most of that stuff ourselves. And for us, that was an interesting tenet of an incubator, where an incubator traditionally takes people who have been through this process before, and they spend a lot of time talking to younger people about what they've learned. And one of the tenets of the Foundry is that that model's broken. Specifically, when you go in and analyze it, you'll find that the skill set needed to mentor and the skills that are needed inside of the vertical spaces where the entrepreneurs work don't match. You'll also find that there's an adverse selection bias, where the folks that are really interested in mentoring people aren't always that good. You'll also find that there's a scalability problem, where if you have a set of mentors and a mentor needs to talk to an entrepreneur or a set of entrepreneurs, you're limited in the scale of the amount of effect you can have by the number of mentors that you have. And similarly, you're limited in terms of portability, because you can't actually take a program like Foundry and take it to someplace like Armenia and implement it, because you're dependent upon this core set of mentors that exist in a physical domain, and you can't pick up and move those folks outside of Utah or Silicon Valley or wherever else they exist. So the second point here, that we're a document-driven organization, really comes from the design excellence theories of being able to document and prove these test hypotheses. We do these on different schedule bases. You'll find that every week inside of the Foundry has to produce a management report. They have to come to a meeting and talk amongst their peers for an hour about how to solve each other's problems. They'll spend an hour and a half every month in a board review, which is more like a board meeting for them. And then this whole process is governed by what's the mission of their business, what are the objectives that they have, and what are the key results that they're expected to find. And then these reports and meetings and board reviews backfill trying to solve those particular problems. The just-in-time training materials also a little bit of a disconnect with, I think, the current generation, where we found rather than have mentors or rather than have some sort of speaking sessions or long pre-recorded audio segments or large documents to read, the group that we were interacting said, you know what we'd really like to see is videos. We're the YouTube generation. And they really need to be not any longer than 3 to 5 minutes. And incidentally, we won't watch something that's not appropriate for very long. So we'd really like to know within these videos, if somebody says anti-dilution, and I'm an entrepreneur and I don't know what that is, I really want to be able to jump out of that video and go to a video on anti-dilution and watch that video and come back to the place where I was. And similarly, if I'm watching a presentation on intellectual property, for example, and I already understand this concept, I'd really like to go forward to something that's a little more enveloping for the same concept. So we try to deliver training that's not only scalable across multiple entrepreneurs, but also solves these real-time methods. What makes the Foundry unique, then, in many ways, is that we cater to a broad group of entrepreneurs, where something like an incubator is typically designed for a vertical segment, like we're a social media software incubator. Right? The Foundry has businesses that are bicycle parts discounters and cupcake shops and custom suit designing type of businesses. They run the whole gamut of the things that you would care to do being an entrepreneur here in Utah. And also interestingly, we don't actually charge any fees for what we do. We don't try and take any equity from the entrepreneurs, and we try and make sure that the things that they need to do are not impeded by us trying to take some sort of percentage of ownership of what they do. We don't provide any equity capital, which you may think, well, that's a bummer for an entrepreneur. It turns out that you can actually destroy a lot of businesses by giving them too much capital, and you can waste a lot of the entrepreneur's time by not forcing them to actually prove whether their business is viable. You give an entrepreneur a lot of money, they'll waste a lot of time building things and designing things that don't actually have a business purpose. Whereas if they have to go figure that stuff out on their own, it seems to be a lot more efficient. Also, providing equity capital seems to destroy the culture that we're trying to create. As a collaborative culture, it turns a lot of entrepreneurs into a kind of competitive organization, and it actually destroys this design experiment. We find that this open curriculum that we developed is more scalable, and also focus on training the entrepreneur, not the company. This means that we don't actually care if your business fails. In fact, if your business is going to fail, we'd like for you to fail quickly and get on to doing another business. Maybe you do your own business over and over and over. You do a second business and a third and a fourth. Or maybe you decide, you know what, I don't really have a viable business idea, but I'm hanging out in a culture of entrepreneurs. I'm going to help someone else work on their particular business. And as we mentioned before, this peer-to-peer coaching allows us to skip the skills mismatch, the adverse selection problem, and the scalability and portability problems associated with organizations that try to drive things out of mentors. So you may think, well, this seems really bright, right? Ken seems like a moderately smart guy, and Rob seems like a freaking genius. Why don't other people figure this out? And frankly, it was just a matter of time before everyone figured this out. It's not rocket science. When you look at the cost of discovering business or incubating business and executing a business, that cost has dropped dramatically over the last 20 years. So today, you can actually turn around a business concept without having to have a bunch of startup capital, without having to have a lot of equipment, without having to have a large engineering resource team. You can actually solve a business to figure out whether it's a business and then actually get on to building it or start another one with relatively limited resources.